Chapter 14 is kind of fun. It's titled Advanced Pricing Techniques, but it's really going to be looking at different ways that firms may decide to set prices as alternatives to the kind of rule of thumb marginal revenue equal marginal cost approach that we had with the previous chapters. There'll be 3 of them that we will be able to discuss: price discrimination, multiple products, and cost plus pricing. So let's look at each of those in turn. I can't recall if we discussed consumer surplus. You may have remembered it in some of your previous micro classes. The idea was that you had this downward sloping demand curve and people paid a single price for whatever product they're interested in buying. And that may have seemed kind of strange because the whole point of a downward sloping demand curve was to show that people vary as to their willingness to pay for this product. And so you had some people who were willing to pay a lot for the product, and we kind of lined them up on the left-hand side of the demand curve at the highest end of it. And then as you move towards the right, you kind of had successively lower levels of willingness to pay from the rest of the demanders. But again, you get this picture that people are all along this spectrum of demand, willingness to pay for this product. And it may have seemed kind of strange to say, well, even though there's this huge spectrum of people's willingness to pay, we're only going to set one price. We're only going to charge one uniform price for every unit of the product that we sell. Again, it might seem kind of weird to do that in the face of this knowledge. What might seem a little more useful for the company is to try to capture all of that consumer surplus. Why don't we try to charge a high price for the high demanders and charge a low price for the low demanders? That would seem to be a way of capturing the rest of that consumer surplus. Because again, if you are charging the same price for every unit, then you're probably underselling to the high demanders, and you're probably charging too much for some of the low demanders. I mean, so much that they're not even willing to buy it at all. So if you could charge people based on their willingness to pay, then you might be able to capture that consumer surplus, or the happiness that the high demanders received from buying the product at less than their willingness to pay. The firm may be able to capture some of that happiness by actually charging them closer to what they are willing to pay. And so as far as the buyer is concerned, they're still willing to buy it as long as, again, the price is at least equal to or somewhat below their willingness to pay. So the consumer is still happy with being able to purchase, and of course the firm is much happier being able to charge a price that's a lot closer to the customer's willingness to pay than this single uniform price before. This idea of charging people different prices based on their willingness to pay is what we call price discrimination. And I guess the basic definition is just charging different prices for the same product. But as we'll see, that the reason you do this is to charge people based on their willingness to pay. And again, the company wants to be able to capture that consumer surplus. So all of the surplus or the happiness that consumers got from being able to purchase at less than their willingness to pay, the firm is trying to turn that into its own profit. And of course, in a lot of situations, this is going to be a more profitable pricing technique than just setting a single price. Of course, it's not easy to do. There are certain particular conditions or assumptions that have to be met for price discrimination to be able to be practiced. Well, they titled this the trouble with uniform pricing. I don't know if it's a trouble per se, if we want to categorize it as that. But again, let's look at a typical, monopolistically competitive or even a monopoly company. Look at their pictures, and we'll assume this constant marginal cost, constant average cost. And we're familiar with being able to figure out the profit maximizing price and quantity from before. You just figure out where that marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Here at point D, that determines your quantity for you. You follow that up to this point U and figure out that your price, your profit maximizing price, will be $7. And that was pretty straightforward. But you can obviously see that there are some people who are willing to pay a lot more than $7. There's some people willing to pay 8, some people willing to pay 9, some people willing to pay all the way up to 10. So their consumer surplus that they are currently enjoying, if we kept charging $7, would be this triangle ABU. Well, the firm may be able to capture that by, let's say, charging $10 to the person who demands it the most, charging $9 to this person, charging $8 to this person, etc. So if the company is able to do that, and for all those individuals in between, then the firm may be able to capture that triangle ABU as its own profit. Again, it would certainly be able to be more profitable than it was before. Prior to setting the uniform price, the amount of profitability would be this box here, BUDC, because that's the area below the price and above its average cost, average total cost. So here's its profit before, but if it could price discriminate, then it could add this extra triangle to it, so its total profit would be this much larger area. And an alternative problem with setting this single uniform price is that there were some people who were willing to pay below $7, but the firm wouldn't find that profit maximizing if it was going to set a uniform price. It wouldn't ever charge below 7. But you can still see that there are some people willing to pay less than 7, but more than the company's costs. So there are some people who are willing to pay $5, and you might say, well, the firm is not as profit maximizing doing that. If it could charge people different prices, if it could charge some people $5 and its costs are $4, well, it would make sense to do that. So there are some people, again, who are willing to pay less than $7, but more than the company's costs, more than their marginal costs or their average costs. So if the company was able to price discriminate amongst those people, then it could gain for itself this extra profit here, this triangle UDF. You have to be a little careful about the definition of price discrimination. We describe it as charging different prices for the same product. This doesn't just mean that anytime there's a price difference that we're going to categorize it as price discrimination. Because again, the definition kind of implies that a company is doing this for a particular reason, to try to tease out high demanders versus low demanders and charge them prices according to their demand. So sometimes prices are different because of cost differences. So I imagine orange juice is a much different cost when it's sold in Florida versus when it's sold in Alaska. And primarily, I wouldn't assume that that's because the consumers in Florida versus Alaska have drastically different demands for orange juice. It's just so much cheaper to produce it and sell it in Florida than it is in Alaska. So if the costs are different, then we don't really call that price discrimination. So to describe a situation as price discrimination, then we have to presume that the costs are fairly similar, if not completely identical. You may have remembered a comparison between price and marginal cost when we did the Lerner Index a couple chapters ago when we were talking about market power. Think back on that as we talk about this next point here. If we are able to effectively price discriminate, there has to be the situation where people's demands differ, where you have some high demanders and some low demanders. And if it's possible for the firm to be able to charge a high price to some people and a lower price to other people, there has to be this inequality between its costs, which again, as you can see above, we're presuming are fairly identical. There has to be this difference between the prices that the high demanders and the low demanders are paying. And again, presuming that their marginal costs are fairly similar, then the ability to price discriminate is going to exist when this price to marginal cost ratio is different. But again, it just kind of demonstrates that as long as your costs are similar, if the prices that your customers are willing to pay differs, then the ability to price discriminate exists. So to be able to price discriminate, there's a few necessary conditions that have to be met, and most of these are going to be pretty obvious actually. A firm has to be able to set different prices, for one thing, so we wouldn't expect Farmer Bob or Farmer Joe to be able to price discriminate because each of them is very, very small, and they are price takers. So the only firms that are able to price discriminate are going to be price makers, firms with some degree of market power. A second situation is that, well, the whole reason that you want to price discriminate is, again, you have some high demanders and some low demanders. So this must imply that there are some buyers who have different price elasticities. If all of your buyers are medium demanders, let's say, then there's really no need or no reason to price discriminate. You have to be able to at least break your customer base into two groups, the high demanders and the low demanders. Maybe more than two groups, but at least two. And a third condition that must be met is that you have to be able to prevent resale of your product between the high demanders and the low demanders, or what they call consumer arbitrage. If this is not possible, if your high demanders and your low demanders kind of get together and chat with each other, then you can presume what's going to happen. If they know they're being charged based on their demand, then you know you're basically never going to see any of the high demanders show up. Kind of like what you did in high school. You would go and find someone to go buy beer for you. The high demanders will find low demanders to go buy the product for them. And so the low demander strolls into the store and says, I want to buy this. And they say, okay, well, we're going to charge you the low demander price because we see you're a low demander. And then the low demander walks out of the store with the product, and the high demander comes up to them and says, okay, well, I'll buy that from you for the price you paid plus $5 or whatever. As long as this kind of parking lot price is less for the high demander than it would be if the high demander actually went into the store, then it's going to be able to circumvent the price discrimination that the company is trying to do. So what do we mean by this first degree price discrimination? There's going to be three different types of price discrimination that economists have uncovered, I suppose. So the first type is this first degree price discrimination, and they call it perfect price discrimination. And you might be able to see why we call it that. You basically charge everybody based on their willingness to pay. So every person's price is different based on their demand, essentially. Every price of the product is different. And if a company is able to do this, then obviously they're going to capture the entire consumer surplus. So this is going to be the mode of price discrimination that is the most profitable for the company. The price that people are willing to pay is equal to their demand, and it's also equal to the marginal revenue, because the extra money coming in would just be equal to whatever that person's willingness to pay is. So the demand curve also becomes the marginal revenue curve again. Why don't all companies do this? It seems like a pretty straightforward thing. Again, the demand curve just shows graphically that people differ as to their willingness to pay. I described the demand curve as lining everybody up based on their willingness to pay. Put the high demanders on the left, low demanders on the right, and you get this demand curve. Can't you just charge everybody based on that? Well, put yourself in the shoes of the customer. Are you willing to walk into the store and making it public knowledge how much you're willing to buy the product? If you've ever bought a car, do you walk onto the showroom or you walk into the dealership and just say, I'm willing to pay $30,000 for this car? And of course you wouldn't do that, because they're not going to sell you it for anything less than that. So the hardest thing about being able to practice this first degree price discrimination is that consumers are never going to reveal their maximum willingness to pay. If anything, they're always going to lowball it, say that they're just ready to go home right now and not think about buying a car today. So it requires a lot of information on the part of the seller. The seller needs to know a lot of information about the customer. And I suppose if there's any car salesmen in the audience, you might know some of the tricks of the questions that they ask you to try to get a sense of that. But it's very difficult. It's very demanding, no pun intended. It's very demanding on the part of the seller to try to get this sort of information to make first degree price discrimination actually work. Another hard thing about it is that you actually have to charge different prices, which may seem like inconsequential, but if you're thinking about a car, let's say, or any other kind of product that's not just a stick of gum or something, then there's probably going to be different negotiations and different contracts that have to be written up. A lot of transactions costs with engaging in those different types of negotiations. Well, let's look at a hypothetical demand and marginal revenue curve, and you can see our marginal cost. Well, you can see the firm is still going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. The kind of fun thing about it, though, is that, again, the marginal cost line is where it was before. My marginal revenue line is the demand curve. And so the quantity that I pick is going to be where those are equal. And, again, I don't actually, you might think again, well, this is going to be your price because that's where that quantity hits the demand curve. Well, remember that I'm charging a different price to basically all these other people. So the last person, I'm charging a $4 price, but to the person next to them, to the left of them, I'm charging $4.01, and then the person left of them, $4.02, etc. And so the total amount of revenue that I'm getting is this whole entire area, OGFA, or origin, GFA. What are my costs? Well, my costs are just the little lower rectangle below the average cost curve. So again, my profit is this entire consumer surplus area, CAF. So to be able to practice first degree price discrimination, you have to be able to charge a different price for the same product, make sure your customers can't swap the product easily. Sometimes this is easier said than done. Second degree price discrimination will not require as much information as first degree, and so it'll be a little easier to implement. It's not going to be as profitable as first degree price discrimination, though. The way you do this is by having different prices that you charge, but in kind of bigger blocks. So one way you can do this is by quantity discounts. You're able to basically charge a higher price to people who don't buy many of these items, and you charge a lower price per unit for the people who buy more. So kind of giving them bulk discounts, quantity discount. And the nice thing about this is that you don't really have to tell how much people want to buy. You might do that before with the first degree case. You knew that there were some high demanders who might not be willing to buy that much, or you knew there were other people who were willing to buy a lot. They weren't willing to pay as high a price, knowing that they were going to have to purchase a lot of them. Well, if you're setting up this quantity discount technique, or this bulk discounting, then the buyers themselves kind of select and sort themselves, and the company doesn't really have to do that as much. The book goes into a couple examples of second-degree price discrimination. One of them is a two-part pricing scheme, where you charge your customers the sort of an access fee, this fixed charge, A, And you might think of that as maybe a membership fee or something like that if at Sam's Club or a golf course or something like that. So there's that fixed charge that everybody pays no matter what you buy. If you don't buy anything, or if you buy a lot of stuff, or if you don't play any rounds of golf, or you play a bunch of rounds of golf, everyone pays sort of the same membership fee or fixed access charge. But beyond that, for however many units you actually buy, there's this additional, the second part of the fee, fee per unit, F. Again, one of the, I guess, the important equation that we might think of is for your customers, the total expenditures they make will be this fixed fee that they pay plus this fee per unit F times the quantity of units that they purchase. Again, the firm wants to be able to capture all of this consumer surplus and turn it into profit for itself. It always sounds kind of weird, capturing the consumer surplus, like they're handcuffing all these consumers and taking all their happiness from them. We have to remember, though, that a buyer is willing to buy a product even if they get $1 of consumer surplus, even if they have kind of a minuscule amount of consumer surplus, because that still means that they're paying less than they were willing to pay. So certainly I can presume that if I was willing to pay $30,000 for a car and I only had to pay $1 for it, well, that makes me exceedingly happy. But if I was willing to pay $30,000 for a car and I only had to pay $29,000 for it, I would still be happy to buy the car. I would still buy it. I might not be as happy when the car was offered to me for only $1, but $29,000 to pay for a car I'd be willing to pay $30,000 for, that still makes me happy. I still buy that car. If a firm is able to capture this consumer surplus, it doesn't really harm the consumers in any way. And so going back to this two-part pricing technique, a way that the entire consumer surplus could be captured is setting that fixed per unit charge equal to the company's marginal cost. And that makes sense. I mean, if the company is producing this product, every unit that they're producing has this additional cost of this marginal cost. If the fee charged to the customers is equivalent to that, then that would seem to make sense. And that membership fee, or that fixed access charge, if you could just set that equal to the entire consumer surplus, then that could turn into your profit. So the book goes into an example of the optimal type of pricing technique for a golf course. And let's say you had individual golfers here, and they had their individual demand curves and individual margin revenue from that. And you can see that the marginal cost of providing a round of golf is fairly low. I mean, you have to gas up the golf carts, I suppose, and greens are tended and all that stuff. If the company just set a uniform price, then, like always, the marginal revenue equals marginal cost there at point D. So there'd be 115 rounds of golf per person. Again, this is in a per person basis. And so we would say 115 rounds of golf per person. That goes up to hit the demand curve at point U. And that means that the profit maximizing price would be $67.50. Again, I can see that there's all this extra consumer surplus that we would lose if we set that uniform price. I would lose all this extra consumer surplus here. And certainly there are some people who are willing to pay less than $67.50, but more than the company's marginal cost to be able to play golf. So if we could practice this first degree price discrimination, then we could gain all of this revenue, O, C, down to E and F. If we could practice first degree price discrimination, we could gain all of that as revenue. And since our costs are fairly small here, at least on this average variable cost, then you can gain all this consumer surplus. We can gain all of that as profit. And again, the problem is that we don't exactly know what people's willingness to pay is. These golfers are not going to show up saying how much they love playing golf. What if we said, well, why don't we set this fixed fee equal to $10, equal to their marginal cost? So every time someone wants to play a round of golf, they have to pay $10. That would be equal to our company's marginal cost. So if there were this 230 rounds of golf played, then we just charge $10 for it, and you get O, A, E, F, that little rectangle. And if you charged an annual fee, or this membership fee, equal to the area of A, C, E, which you might be able to estimate given whatever your estimated demand equation is, then you wouldn't necessarily need to know, you wouldn't need to know at all people's willingness to pay. You would just need to take some data and construct a demand curve from it, and you could figure out sort of what the consumer surplus triangle is, and you set that, whatever the dollar amount of that is, set that equal to what your annual fee, your membership fee would be, and you'd be able to capture the entire consumer surplus as your company's profit. Okay, other types of second degree price discrimination, again, charging people blocks of different prices, is this, well, declining block pricing, and it'll make sense as we look at it. basically you're giving quantity discounts over different groups. So instead of having a membership fee and then another type of fee per unit, you're giving people quantity discounts at different levels. So we have our standard sets of curves here. We charge everybody the same price, $7. You get units of 30, and you'd have this profit of B, D, and E would be the company's profit. But again, I can see that maybe if I can't charge everybody based on their willingness to pay, as in first degree, we could maybe charge different prices. So I can see here that based on where the demand curve is, $9 price is associated with the demand of 10 units. An $8 price is associated with the demand of 20 units. $7 price is associated with the demand of 30 units. And again, I could figure all that out if I knew what the demand curve looked like. So why don't we say that if you're going to buy from 0 to 10 units, you have to pay $9 for each unit. If you're going to buy more units than 10, like 11 through 20, the 11th through 20th units that you buy, we're only going to charge you $8 for those. If you're going to buy 21 to 30 units, then for those, we will charge you $7. So again, you're kind of giving people these bulk discounts, and it allows you to capture more areas of that demand curve. You don't capture the entire consumer surplus because there's still a few sort of white triangles you can see in there above those blue blocks that we're not able to capture, but it's certainly you're capturing a lot more than just the area B, D, E. The most frequently used type of price discrimination is what they call third degree price discrimination. And here you're discriminating amongst people not really based on their willingness to pay or not charging them different prices in kind of an elaborate scheme, but you're really just taking some other characteristic, some demographic characteristic, visible characteristic, and charging people based on that. So you're presuming this proxy where whether you're a high demander or a low demander is proxied by some other variable, some other factor. And so ladies' night, senior citizen discounts, those sorts of things. Lower prices for kids, weekend prices versus weekday prices. So let's say there's these two markets, market 1 and number 2. And what the company wants to be able to do is to allocate their sales so that the marginal revenues in those two different markets are equal to each other. So the extra revenue coming in from an extra unit of sales is equal across all of the different markets. And they're going to try to sum up all of the marginal revenue from all of their markets together to get this MRT, this total marginal revenue. And if they can set that equal to their company's marginal cost, then that will allow them to maximize their profits. And so we'll see what that looks like. Again, what the company wants to try to do is to allocate its output so that its marginal revenue is equal across all of its different markets. This is going to end up meaning that the more elastic market gets a lower price and the less elastic market gets a higher price. And that should make sense why that would happen. I mean, your less elastic consumers are the ones who don't feel like there are as many substitutes, who are willing to pay higher prices for things. So they're the ones who do get charged a higher price. So you can see here, market 1, market 2, it looks like in market 2 they have a lot more demand. Market 1, they don't have as much. If there were 500 units sold, and let's say that these are two different towns, because again, we want to say that there's no ability for resale. So let's say these are two different towns that are kind of far apart. And the company wants to sell 500 units, and at this point they're selling 250 in each of them. And you can kind of see where the 250 quantity point hits the marginal revenue lines, hits the demand lines in each place. And so right now they're selling a $35 price in market 1, and they're selling a $55 price in market 2. And you can see, 250 units sold in each of those. You can see how much total revenue is coming in, $22,500. Well, if they decided to make their marginal revenues equal, I mean, you can see before that in market 1, the marginal revenue was $10 at 250 units, and in market 2, the marginal revenue for 250 units was $30. So let's say they kind of split the difference to try to make those equal, to make them equivalent. They looked at points V and V prime to see that marginal revenue in market 1 equaled marginal revenue in market 2, $20 a piece. Well, there that would mean that, I guess they don't show it there in market 1, but they would be charging a $40 price in market 1, and they'd be charging a $50 price in market 2. And they end up, if you calculate total revenue, they end up getting higher total revenue as a result of that, setting the margin revenues equal to each other. Well, you might have wondered, how do they know what the marginal revenue should be? Or how did they know how much total output they should have produced? How did they know it was 500? Well, you can basically take your two marginal revenues and combine them to, again, make this total marginal revenue curve. Hopefully that makes sense. Total marginal revenue curve. Okay, so think about these two different markets, and we just put their marginal revenue curves in the same graph on the left-hand side. So I've got MR1 and MR2. When price is $40, I can see that in MR1 there is a 100 units that's associated with that, and then in the market 2, the marginal revenue at $40 is 200 units. And so the total, if I'm going to make this total marginal revenue curve, then at a $40 price, I should associate that with 300 units. And so you can see that as point L over in my picture here. And so the outline of this shape, this marginal revenue total curve here, is just the horizontal summation of these two curves together. You can do the same sort of thing with the demand curve. And if I have this marginal cost equal to 20, then I can get my sense of the quantity that I want to produce based on where that marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue total curve. And you might think, again, if I follow that up to a $45 price, that I should charge $45. And that would be my profit maximizing. But remember that these are two separate markets. They have two different demands. You have one of the markets is a high demander, one's a low demander. And you could get away with charging them different prices. If the marginal cost is 20, then the uniform price solution would be $45, but I know I can price discriminate. And so I just see, where does that $20 marginal cost hit the marginal revenue 1 and the marginal revenue 2 lines? So for market 1, at the $20 marginal cost, I see that it hits my MR1 line at 200 units. So I know I want to sell 200 units in market 1. And I can follow that up and see that that's associated with selling at a $40 price in market 1. The $20 marginal cost hits the marginal revenue in market 2 curve at 300 units. So I want to sell 300 of those units in market 2. And I want to sell at a price of $50 in market 2. So I'm selling 200 units in market 1, 300 units in market 2. So I'm selling my 500 total that I wanted to. But I'm selling at a lower price in the lower demanding market, and I'm selling at a higher price and selling more units in the higher demanding market. There are debates whether price discrimination is something that's good for society or bad for society. It usually sounds bad when you describe it, because you're saying that the company's trying to extract this consumer surplus from their customers and to turn it into profit for itself. And so there's a lot of anti-competitive rationales for price discrimination. There's a lot of reasons that companies may do it that have an anti-competitive or sort of anti-consumer reason for it, and those seem pretty clear. The firm is trying to flex its market power muscle by charging higher prices to the higher demanders. Is there a pro-competitive reason? I mean, is there a reason why firms might do this that actually would benefit society or even benefit consumers? On the face of it, you wouldn't think so, and I think most people who may take kind of an antitrust view of things would say, no, there's really no good reason why a company would do this. I mean, certainly you can see why the company itself would benefit, but I don't see how societies would benefit from this. Well, if you step back a little bit and think about it, it might be if you had our two markets there, market 1 and market 2. We said market 1 was the low demander, market 2 was the high demander. If the company had to charge $45, uniform prices in both, market 1 might have, and I don't know if the curve looked like this, but market 1 may have been so small and its demanders such low demanders that they weren't willing to pay a $45 price at all. Or at least the company might have said, well, forget it, we're not even going to sell in market 1 because there are such low demanders. If we have to sell at the same price to everybody, then we're just not going to bother with market 1. Whereas if it could price discriminate, it might be able to kind of, overcharge market 2, I suppose, even though those people are willing to pay it. Overcharge market 2 so that it could fund the provision of its product to market 1. And so it serves more customers when it can price discriminate than if it can't. So not only is it able to serve the inelastic market, which it usually always would be able to anyway, but it can serve this elastic market too. And so you have more people able to buy the product, output is higher, and so you can, again, serve more people. Society is better served by being able to price discriminate in this particular situation. Okay, the book goes into this section on multiple products, which I guess we can talk about, but we can't really solve because it's kind of tricky. A single company may produce multiple products. Johnson & Johnson produces tons of different things. Even Coke and Pepsi, they each produce different flavors of sodas besides just their regular Coke and Pepsi. So certain companies produce multiple products, and sometimes those products are related to one another. So the products that are produced may be substitutes, like Coke and Diet Coke, They may be complementary, like Johnson & Johnson lotion and baby powder or something like that. And so those products and the demand for those products are going to be related because, again, demand for any product is related to substitutes and complements. And so if a company produces both X and Y, which are related in some way, then it wants to also set this marginal revenue equal marginal cost situation. What gets tricky now is that the demand for X and the marginal revenue of X depends not just on X itself, but on the amount of Y that's consumed, if Y is related in some way, if Y is a substitute or a complement. And so this introduces a lot of trickiness. I guess we bring it up here just to mention it, because solving this requires a lot of messy algebra. So we're actually not going to jump into it more here, just to kind of introduce you to this possibility that firms may find themselves in these kinds of situations. Okay, we can talk about bundling also. Companies may produce these multiple products, and if you're not able to price discriminate, if you can't charge different prices for these different products, then a company may find that it's easier or better to bundle the products together, to say we're going to sell both of these as one product and charge a single price if we're not able to price discriminate amongst them both. And this would have to be the case if consumers have different demand prices for each good. So if there's one thing in the bundle that they really want and another thing in the bundle that they don't want as much, you have a high demand product and a low demand product. Are there anti-competitive reasons for it? Well, I suppose people say that if you're bundling two products together, the company's probably trying to use its power in one of those products to charge higher prices for the other one. So if a firm has market power in one good, then they're trying to exert that power over the other good. It seems like an odd argument, because if you're talking about just having market power in one good and you don't have a lot of it in another, then you're actually going to lose power when you bundle, because now you have this different product that is a combination of the two of them, and you would feel like you'd have less market power in the two. Think of it this way: if you had one product that you have a 90% market share in, and the other product has only a 50% market share, so you have a lot of market power in the first, but not much in the second. Well, if you bundle those two together, then your market power kind of maybe averages out, so you only have about 70% in both. So you're not able to kind of transfer your 90% market power into the second good, because if you bundle them, then you're going to lose some. If you want people to actually buy the bundle, you might recognize this with value meals, things like that at fast food restaurants. If you're going to charge a high price for one good, then you're going to end up having to charge a low price for other goods. And it seems like someone's told me that fast food places kind of do this. They end up charging relatively low prices on their hamburgers. If you're going to actually buy a hamburger itself, they're actually charged fairly low, fairly cheaply. What they do charge you a high price for, though, is the sodas and the French fries, because they know that, well, people kind of tend to buy those things together. Are there good reasons, good for society reasons of doing this bundling technique? I've heard of this with computer printers, and they'll bundle their own toner. If you're going to buy this printer, then you're kind of stuck buying our particular type of toner because we have this cartridge that fits in there in a weird way, and you can't buy any other brand of cartridge to fit in there. And you might think, well, geez, this company's just trying to. Not only are they ripping me off with the printer, but they're going to try to rip me off with a toner too, because I can't buy any other type of toner. Well, again, maybe that's got an anti-competitive reason for it, but the company too may also feel like, look, our printers are good, and we design it with this particular type of toner in mind, and if you use any other type of toner, your printouts aren't going to look as good. The quality is going to go down. And so if we bundle our products together, then it's going to help you out, because we can have a lot more control over the types of products that are sort of being used inside of ours. And so the quality of one good is going to drop if you use some other substitute for it. And it may actually be cheaper to provide both goods as a bundle than to try to sell them separately. And so obviously consumers would prefer being charged a lower price if they can get it. The company may also be subject to some price controls on one type of good, but if they bundle it, then the bundled good may not be subject to the control. If you talk to your parents, they may recall the days of the 1970s oil crisis when gasoline was really expensive. The reason it was really expensive wasn't because of the OPEC oil crisis, but because the government actually set price ceilings. And so it was difficult for gas stations. They were forced to charge a relatively low price for gasoline. And so the gas stations knew that there was this excess demand for gasoline because of the price ceiling. And so they started to say, well, okay, if you come to our gas station, if all you're going to do is buy gas, well, that's forced upon us to be really cheap. But hey, why don't you come to the full serve pump? And not only will we fill you up with gas, but we'll check your oil, and we'll spit on your windshield and clean all the flies off, and we'll smile at you, and we'll check the air in your tires and do all this other fancy stuff. And so a lot of gas stations moved to this full service format because, well, the price control was just on the gas. And the gas station could say, hey, we're still charging the price ceiling on the gas. It's just we're going to charge a lot more for the checking the tires and cleaning the windshield and stuff. And so they were able to make up the fact that the price ceiling was pushing the price artificially low by having this quote-unquote full service where they could make up the difference. Another type of pricing technique that companies may use, and a lot of what we've talked about before, being able to price discriminate, being able to bundle, actually could allow the firm to be more profitable than it could before. This cost plus pricing technique, you go ahead and put a technique in quotes, it's a way of pricing. It ends up usually not being profit maximizing. It's a simple way to set prices, but usually it's not going to be profit maximizing. So all the company does is just say, well, we know what our costs are, and let's just charge a markup, a particular percentage markup over our average cost. And certainly it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get this profit maximizing price. If you're not talking about any marginal revenue or marginal cost concepts, then you can't guarantee that you're going to be profit maximizing. Again, all you're looking at is your average cost instead of your marginal cost. So it's kind of throwing a dart at a dartboard, and maybe you get lucky and the markup that you charge is sort of the correct amount, but it's certainly, again, kind of a lot more random. It's a lot less likely that you'll be profit maximizing. So we can see some of the difficulties with this cost plus pricing technique. Pick out at random demand margin revenue curves, short run marginal cost, average total cost curves. And let's say that the company just says, well, heck, we want to produce 5,000 units. Not exactly sure why, if that's the amount we want to do. And they choose a 50% markup to get a price of $30 because they know that their average total cost is $20. So they set this 50% markup, $30 price. There's no way, based on the demand curve, there's no way that they can sell at a $30 price. There's no way that they can sell 5,000 units. They can only sell something less than that. And I guess the slide here says 4,000 units. So they sell 4,000 units. They get this particular profit margin here, and you can see how much profit they make, how much revenue they get, profit they make from that. Again, I can see that profit maximizing would be down here, where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost, and you get your quantity here. So they're really overshooting their quantity. And the price that they should charge would be a $40 price. Well, again, that would require their markup to actually be 100% instead of 50%. I suppose it's possible that they could just guess and say, hey, let's charge a $40 price if our costs are $20. And that would mean that we would sell 3,000 units. They might be able to guess at that, but it's certainly not guaranteed. And so again, this is kind of a haphazard, shot in the dark sort of way of approximating profit maximization when there is a much more accurate way you could do it.